Hello, YouTube. We have, most of us, heard this name and know that it was he who found the legendary Homeric Troy. But how much do we know about this man's life, about the difficulties and problems he had to face, proving his case to the whole world? Heinrich Schliemann was born in 1822. It happened in Germany in a town called Neuburg. His father, being a Protestant priest, was not at all pious. On the contrary, the pastor drank very heavily and beat his wife and children. For his behavior, which did not correspond to the position of a priest, Schliemann Sr. was deprived of church dignity. His wife had died by that time, and with the inheritance she left to her children, the widower opened an inn. The children were left without a family and a basically piece of bread, so to say. From the age of 14, Heinrich was forced to earn and live independently. He served as a messenger in the store and studied trade there. After several years of working as an errand boy, the young man took on a job as a cabin boy on a ship, and in 1841 he embarked to Venezuela. But destiny intervened in Henry's fantasies. The ship on which he was embarking on a new life ran aground near Amsterdam. The crew and passengers ended up in the city, including Schliemann, who was frozen, soaked, and half-dressed. He had no friends there, no money for a bed or a meal. But Schliemann desperately clung to life and tried to survive through all the hardships. After a few terrible days, he managed to get a job as a mail carrier. Life gradually began to improve, but there was still too little money. And even these pitiful pennies Schliemann spent not at all on clothes or an extra piece of food, but on books and textbooks. He decided to become rich and famous by all means, and for this it was necessary to have knowledge. Heinrich learned several languages at once: English, French, Italian, Portuguese, Swedish, and Spanish. He had phenomenal linguistic abilities. A year later, he was already working as a clerk, not a humble messenger. At the same time, he continued to learn languages according to his own method. He took a text in an unfamiliar language, translated it into his native language using a dictionary, and then tried to translate it back into the original language and compare the resulting texts, correcting mistakes along the way. The knowledge of Russian, which the young man learned among other languages, was very useful when the company needed its representative in Russia. It was the enterprising and inquisitive Heinrich Schliemann who went to this rich country. Schliemann arrived in St. Petersburg in early 1846. He was a slender, short, about 160 centimeters young man with a disproportionately large head. The young man had little capital, but he lived very modestly, saving on everything except clothes. He was well aware that he was greeted according to the clothes he wore, so he didn't skimp on expensive English suits. There is no doubt that Schliemann was a very talented businessman, as evidenced by his rapid commercial success. In Russia, he achieved a solid reputation and respect in merchant circles. At the same time, the passion for mystification persisted. Researchers noticed that Schliemann used about 10 variants of the name and patronymic in Russian documents: Henry Ivanovich, Andrei Ivanovich, Alexander Ivanovich, Alexander Nikolaevich, Alexander Aristovich, Andrei Aristovich, Henry Augustovich, Henry Oskarovich, and the photo of himself in an expensive fur coat that was sent to his sister was signed by the director of the Imperial Bank, although he had nothing to do with this institution. In Russia, he successfully engaged in entrepreneurial activities and earned good money for himself and his employers, and soon founded his own company. So in 1847, Heinrich received Russian citizenship. After traveling to America for a short time, Schliemann managed to double his fortune there. You see, in 1850 also news came of the death of Ludwig's brother, who had gone to America to make money. For reasons not entirely clear, Heinrich also followed his brother's footsteps to California, and he found himself in the midst of the gold rush. With a small amount of cash, Schliemann created a primitive but profitable enterprise. He bought gold dust from the miners on the spot and then resold it to the bank and put the difference in his pocket. The business was quite risky. Schliemann wrote that he had to sleep with a revolver under his pillow, but the profits were fabulous. Schliemann returned to Russia quite rich. So, returning to Russia, he became one of the richest persons in St. Petersburg. At the same time, the wealthy man possessed a passion atypical for merchants of the world. He was madly in love with Homer's Iliad, ready to enjoy the famous immortal lines for hours. Moreover, he dreamed of proving that the mythical Homeric Troy actually existed. The beauties of St. Petersburg were not at all averse to marrying a young millionaire. At the age of 30, Heinrich married Ekaterina Lyzhina, who belonged to a wealthy merchant family, and he became a merchant of the first guild. The young wife gave birth to 3 children for Schliemann, but this did not help the family to become happy. Ekaterina could not understand her husband's passion for some strange book, his love of the ancient Greek language and ancient history. There were constant scandals in the house, and the entrepreneur was in no hurry to get under his own roof, preferring to stay longer at work. A few years later, Schliemann decided to completely and irrevocably change his life, and finally indulge in his passion unconditionally. The turning point came in the late 1850s. The successful merchant grew bored, and commercial matters worried him less and less. He lived by inertia. He controlled his affairs. He did a lot of sports, daily swimming in the sea, horseback riding, skating, and gymnastics at the sports club, and he learned languages, modern Greek and ancient Greek. Schliemann went to see the world: Germany, Italy, Egypt, Holy Land, Syria, Turkey, Greece. He returned to Russia, plunged back into business. He was elected a member of the commercial court. He was, as I said, the merchant of the first guild in the capital. He was an honorary citizen. But soon he left again, this time on a trip around the world. Technically, he was going to study commercial proposals for establishing new trade relations, and this was partly true. Another thing is that Schliemann seemed to have lost interest in commerce and was looking for a new application to his abilities. Schliemann described his journey in a book in French. There, for the first time, he confessed to readers that faced with ancient culture of distant countries, he regretted his lack of systematic education, without which it was impossible to understand the meaning of what he saw. Schliemann returned to Russia and tried to convince his wife to go with him to Europe, but was refused. He invested money in real estate, as the reconstruction of the city by Baron Osman was in full swing at that time. Schliemann participated in the construction of 7 multi-story apartment buildings. Having received a stable income, the 42-year-old Schliemann went to study, more precisely to listen to paid lectures by university professors on topics of interest to him, without passing exams or getting a diploma. Ekaterina Petrovna still flatly refused to go to Paris, and she perceived her husband's sudden urge for knowledge as a whim, if not madness. But the spouse was also refused a divorce. Apparently, it was at this time that Schliemann made 2 key decisions that determined his subsequent life: the desire to glorify himself on the scientific path and the idea of creating a new family. With his usual enthusiasm, Schliemann set about putting his ideas into practice. The divorce was filed in the United States. First, Schliemann and his lawyers presented evidence in court that Heinrich had been living in New York for the past 7 years and even had a stake in a reputable local firm, which gave him the right to obtain citizenship. This was followed by a lawsuit for dissolution of the marriage, where Schliemann presented letters from his wife in which she flatly refused to move with her husband. Some people say these were fakes, but the judges chose not to notice it. By the way, it was precisely for the unauthorized acquisition of the second citizenship and bigamy that Russian Tsar Alexander II, as we call him, the liberator, promised to hang his former subject. So in 1865, he closed down his business in St. Petersburg, withdrew funds, and went to Paris. Yes, Schliemann sold his business, said goodbye to his family, to whom he left a large fortune, and left Russia, escaping the gallows too. His wife's shocked friends and relatives could not come to their senses. No one expected this from Heinrich. Meanwhile, Schliemann was methodically pursuing his long-held dream of finding evidence of ancient Troy, which Homer wrote about. Schliemann went to Paris and at the age of 46 became a student at the Sorbonne, attending lectures on archaeology. At the same time, he met the Greek Sophia Engastromenos. She was a young, beautiful, educated girl from a good family who knew the history of her native country well and managed to become Schliemann's friend and associate. Well, she was almost 30 years younger than her husband. In fact, as some people say, Heinrich bought a young girl who made the sacrifice to save a bankrupt family. The newlyweds settled in Greece, and finally Heinrich found himself in the land of his dreams, together with a loving and understanding woman. By the way, she later gave him 2 children, whom the parents named after the mythological Agamemnon and Andromach. Having solved his personal problems, Schliemann was finally able to seriously indulge in the goal that he pursued. They say for all his life, the search for Troy. He bought the equipment and traveled to Turkey in April of 1870. According to his calculations, it was here, under the hill of Hisarlik, that the mythical country should be located. The hired workers dug the earth that had been caked for centuries, and Schliemann was sure that the ancient city was next to him and had no doubt about his success. During the excavations, several cultural layers were discovered, but Schliemann was sure it's not his Troy. It should be a beautiful, majestic city, but in the meantime, only pitiful buildings had been discovered. By the way, archaeologists still cannot forgive Schliemann for his amateurish endeavors. The researcher, not knowing the historical value of what he found, ruthlessly destroyed ancient strata, did not make detailed inventories of the discovered finds, etc. His amateurish disdain for excavation methods and accurate fixation of finds led to the fact that the monument was actually destroyed. For professional archaeologists always carefully record every ancient fragment and shard, where it lay, what was nearby. But in defense of the amateur researcher, we can say that in those days archaeology was not yet as rigorous and science as it is now, and the methodology for conducting such research developed much later. In the 3rd year of excavation, Schliemann finally got lucky. The ancient foundations of buildings were discovered, scorched by fire. Homer claimed that Troy was burned, and now finally evidence of this has been found. But that was just the beginning. Soon, near the remains of a large building, which Schliemann considered the ruins of the magnificent palace of King Priam, a huge amount of gold jewelry was found. Necklaces, bracelets, rings, brooches, tiaras, chains. Schliemann dug up all the splendor alone with his wife, because as soon as he saw that gold was shining in the ground, he immediately sent local workers to rest. The seeker had no doubt that otherwise the treasure would be stolen. For the same reason, he urgently collected everything he found and tried to quickly take it to Europe. Meanwhile, according to the agreement concluded with the Turkish government, Schliemann had to give half of what he found to this country. Turkey demanded its share, so Schliemann paid 50,000 francs, and after that the persecution by the authorities was stopped. Schliemann offered the treasure he found to the Hermitage Museum, but Russia rejected such a generous gift. The reason was probably that the Orthodox Russian Christian Church did not recognize divorces, and the Russian government could not forgive Schliemann for divorcing Ekaterina Lyzhina, which was done contrary to Russian laws. The researcher presented the treasures of Troy to his native Germany and immediately became a national hero. Schliemann became widely popular all over the world at that time. The newspapers wrote about the sensational find. Journalists enthusiastically talked about a man who'd managed to rise from poverty to wealth, convinced skeptical archaeologists that they were wrong, and really found the legendary Troy. It was then that the archaeology became a fashionable science. The governments of many countries increased the funds allocated for excavations. Until the end of his life, Schliemann tried to fix what he had done in his unrestrained pursuit of fame, and he partially succeeded. He reconciled with the Turkish authorities by paying for the stolen valuables. He admitted that he was mistaken and allowed the scientists to access his materials. He completely changed the approach to excavations and later not only dug in accordance with scientific methods, but even improved them. For example, he introduced mandatory in situ photographing of layers and individual finds. Some scientists recognized his remorse and changed their anger to mercy, while others remained firm in their rejection of the nouveau riche. Schliemann still had more time to discover Tyrrhenes and Mycenae for science, holding scientific conferences in Troy, build a museum in Athens, and write several books. So, in his new search in Greece, in Mycenae, he discovered rich royal tombs, in which he found the treasure of the king of Mycenae. Maybe I don't mispronounce it right, Mycenae. The treasure contained death masks, crowns, bracelets, rings, wine cups, tiaras, and gold buttons. He donated this treasure to the Museum of Athens. Later, Schliemann was engaged in research on the island of Ithaca, as well as in the ancient cities of Orchomen and Tyrrhenes. Shortly before his death, Schliemann went back to Turkey to his family, conducted excavations there. In 1890, he went to Italy for medical treatment, but died suddenly in Naples. The researcher was buried in Athens, the same legendary land to which he had longed all his life and in which he found eternal peace. Well, he will remain an amateur, but with his enthusiasm, he was able to infect many people with a love of ancient history. And his life path will be an example of how hard work and perseverance can achieve almost any heights. But there is something else I need to tell you. In 1945, the gold of Troy stored in Berlin ended up in the USSR, partly in the Hermitage Museum and partly in the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts. For a long time, they preferred in the Soviet Union to keep silent about this, and only in the 1990s the collection was first presented to the public, after which conversations about the scientific interpretation of this treasure resumed. So what happened is that on the evening of April 27, 1945, the Soviet army entered Berlin, and on May 2nd, soldiers captured an anti-aircraft tower near the Berlin Zoo. In addition to the hospital and the refugees, it contained treasures from the Berlin museums. Among the latter were 3 impressive boxes with the famous gold of Troy. The find, however, soon disappeared again. And again, it was discovered in the early 1990s in Moscow. You see, since 1922, those treasures had been on display in the Museum of Prehistory and Early History in Berlin. From there, along with objects from other museums, they were evacuated to the anti-aircraft tower at the zoo, specially built to protect against air raids and considered an ideal shelter. It was done under orders of the crazed Führer himself. The Wehrmacht troops looted and destroyed a huge part of the cultural heritage of the conquered people in various parts of Europe. Therefore, even in the midst of the war, the issue of the compensation for losses came up. In 1942, a special commission was established to determine losses in the field of culture. According to its data published in the late 1940s, 173 museums, 4,000 libraries, and archives were damaged. Within the framework of this organization, the Bureau of Expertise operated, which was headed by the famous Soviet artist, restorer, and art historian Igor Grabar. The museum artifacts found in the anti-aircraft tower at the zoo had to be exported to the USSR first. The Berlin Zoo must come under the control of the Anglo-American occupation zone, so an order has been issued to begin moving all valuable objects from the anti-aircraft bunker to the eastern part of Berlin as soon as possible, and for now to store them in warehouses at Treskov Castle in Friedrichsfeld and in the Berlin Slaughterhouse. Andrei Belokopytov, head of the Trophy Brigade of the Art Committee for the Arts, wrote in one of his letters. Some of the most important works soon left Berlin. On June 30, 1945, a special flight took off the Tempelhof airfield to Moscow's Vnukovo airport. The Pushkin Museum became one of the reception points for valuable cargo in the Soviet capital, in particular the gold of Troy. In 1949, all these objects, by decision of the country's leadership, were placed in the so-called special fund without the right to publish and exhibit them. Special instructions forbid access to it to anyone except the keepers. In the 1950s, the Soviet authorities made a political decision to return to East Germany some of the works of art exported from Germany, among which were, for example, the masterpieces of the Dresden Gallery. The list also included the Schliemann treasures of Troy, but 260 objects made of gold, silver, rock crystal, and stone remained in Moscow, and 414 bronze and ceramic artifacts remained in the Hermitage. The reason why they stayed in the USSR is still unknown. Until almost mid-1990s, Schliemann's collection remained inaccessible to scientists and the general public. Moreover, due to its long-term presence in the special storage, it was even considered to be lost. So it was only in December of 1994 that experts had the opportunity to study it in detail for the first time. 2 years later, the opening of the exhibition Treasures of Troy from the excavations of Heinrich Schliemann took place in the Pushkin Museum, which allowed thousands of people to see the famous collection. So this is the story I wanted to let you know today about Troy and an adventurer and a tough guy named Heinrich Schliemann. And if you like my research, please kindly support it through the links you'll find in the description to this channel. Please subscribe to my channel. Please tell others about my work. Thank you.